Welcome to another episode of Mythic Drafting, where today I'll be taking you through my top 10 tips and tricks for draft. This video is focused at beginners to intermediate players, really. And the first thing to consider is why should you listen to me as to how to get better at draft. I've just snipped out here my overall win rate, my Lord of the Rings win rate, and my March of the Machines win rate here. So overall on Arena, you can see 61.7% win rate, and I trophy in about a quarter of my drafts, and that's increased in Lord of the Rings, where I win at 65%, and March of the Machine, 62.5%. I've been playing for about 10 to 15 years at this point in time, on and off, so I've got a lot of experience playing mainly draft and sealed. So without further ado, let's get into the tips. The first being, you need to know the best commons in a format. It's really important, I think, to be able to identify the cards that you're going to see the most frequently, which of them are good, which of them are average, and which of them are below average, and then of course which ones are the best. And what I've done here is I've put some of the better commons from the last two sets, Lord of the Rings and March of the Machine, and these four cards are just absolutely insane. They're in the best color, and in order to identify this, I'd recommend going on 17 lands or reading some articles in order to show you which commons are the best commons in each color for that set. And then when you're drafting, you want to look out for those because, as we'll get to later, they can form signals. But also, they're the cards that, when your uncommons and rares aren't good, that you're going to want to first pick and go into those colors. The other important thing I think here to note is that you want to know which colors are the best, and then prioritize the commons in those colors as well early in draft. Tip number 2 is to stay open early. I think this is really important, and something that I see drafters do that leads to a mistake is they might take a black card, then take a red card, and then take a blue card. And sometimes this can be correct, but one of the biggest tips I have is that if you've got, say you first pick a black card like Sauron the Necromancer, and then there's a good black common and a good blue common, you should favour your early colour in order to stay open. So you should bump up the other black commons, because there's such a benefit in drafting in one colour to start a draft, in that you can read the table as to what your second colour will be and make sure it's open, and just be really flexible as well. And then you're not spreading yourself too thin. But one thing to note here is you can't compromise power while doing so. If there is like a good black common, but there's a fantastic red common pick too, you should take the fantastic red card and take the power. The next thing to note is that you need to read the signals while doing this. So if you do stay open early, it's important that you keep a lookout for when a powerful common has come a little bit too late and to go there. And lastly, don't overcommit to your first pick. This is something I see players do far too often. It's the pick with the least amount of information, and if you get stuck to it, you could easily end up in the least open color and have a subpar deck. So don't tie yourself too much to it. Stay open and be flexible in the early portion of the draft. The next is you need to eat your bread. Bread is a saying that has been around a long time in limited magic theory, and it stands for bombs, removal, evasion, aggro, and duds. Now this is a little bit of an oversimplistic take on drafting these days, but for a first principle and a basic idea, I think it still makes sense. It's the order you want to take cards in. Bombs being first are cards like Sauron, then removal like Smite the Deathless, and then evasive cards, so creatures that have flying or some way of being unblockable, and then aggro, low curve cards, and then finally the duds, the filler. And as a general rule, this is how you pretty much want to start taking cards in draft. You want to pick bombs first, and then if there's no bombs in the pack, you look for removal, and then after that you look for the rest. But you've also got to be fluid in the way you're drafting. If you've already got a ton of bombs but not any removal, then you might bump removal up. This is just a good little tip to remember as you draft, that you need to prioritize all of these things in roughly that order. The next is curve. Curve is so important in draft. You want your deck to have majority 2 drops, then 3 drops, then 4 drops, then 5 drops, and all in diminishing numbers. So you might start, an ideal deck might have, say, 4 or 5 1 drops, then it might have 8 2 drops, 5 or 6 3 drops, 3 or 4 4 drops, and then maybe 2 to 3 5 and 6 drops. And what this does is, if you think about how you draw your deck, it means that you're far more likely to draw early plays early and less likely to draw a hand of 4 and 5 cost cards. And this will mean that when you actually play the games, you're much more consistently going to play a 2 drop, then play a 3 drop, and then be able to play a 4 or a 5 drop after that. Whereas If you haven't considered your curve while you're drafting, you might have a hand that just has, say, an Old Man Willow and 2 5-drops and 4 lands, and that might be keepable, but you're only playing, your first play will be turn 4, and then someone else could have gone Woe's Pathfinder into Dunlin Crabane into Old Man Willow, and all of a sudden you're way too far behind and you're never going to catch up. So when you're drafting, make sure you're thinking, have I got enough early plays in my deck? And it's another good rule breaker as a rule of thumb, in that if you're tossing up 2 cards and they're roughly of equal power level, take the lower costed card because it's better for your curve. Now, obviously, that needs to be fluid, and if you've already got 8 2-drops, you might actually take the more powerful, expensive card to make sure you actually have some of those in your deck as well. So always be thinking when you're drafting, curve, curve, curve. The next thing is to be fluid in draft. You can't just have a rigoristic and determined pick order and just flow through that the whole way in draft. Card values change as you draft more of your deck. So as you draft more creatures, for example, if you don't have any removal, the value of each possible removal spell goes way up in your pick order because you do need some ways to deal with your opponent's threats. And similarly, if you've already got 6 or 7 pieces of removal, you may actually devalue it and take slightly weaker cards that are creatures in order to make sure you have your own threats. The other thing is you need to consider the synergies in your own deck. Based on what you've already got, some cards may interact better with those cards and therefore they get more valuable. For example, in the current set, there's a blue-red spells deck which revolves around Fiery Inscription or Gandalf's Sanction. And in that deck, you want as many instants and sorceries as you can possibly get. And so all of the instants and sorceries get significantly bumped up. Even the ones that aren't that good become very, very playable if you've got a solid blue-red spells deck. And the last thing to consider is don't just shut the doors to different decks at any point in the draft. You need to be constantly assessing, what do I have in my pool? What decks could I pivot into? And, for example, you might be black-white with like 7 black cards and 2 white cards after pack 1. You shouldn't close the door to your other colors. If you open a bomb red card, you might actually say, well, this red card by itself is worth more than the 2 white cards, and I'm going to take it and be flexible and fluid, and then assess for the rest of the draft whether white or red will be your secondary color, given you've already got so many black cards. So just be constantly assessing whether you can go in different directions, and don't autopilot once you believe you've locked yourself into 2 different colors. The next thing to think about is your mana base. Your mana base is really important, and limited mana bases are always pretty terrible. They're nothing like constructed where you have access to all the best dual lands. You're playing single color lands almost always. So you actually need to think, not only are you going to be 2 colors, but you need to be considering how mana intensive are these colors. Claim the Precious, for example, requires you to have 2 swamps early in order to play it. So you probably want to have 9 or 10 swamps in a deck with Claim the Precious in it. So for this reason, single colored pipped cards are more valuable than double costed cards. So if Claim the Precious was 2 and a black, it would be even better than it currently is. So when you're drafting, you want to make sure that you don't have a deck that requires double red, double black, and has a lot of those requirements until later in the games, because then it's going to affect how you curve out. So you need to consider your early picks and how they go together, and your curve in your mana base does matter. As I said, you might have a 3-drop in hand, but if you can't cast it on turn 3 because you don't have the right lands in play, then it's effectively a 4 and a 5-drop. So make sure you're paying attention and not committing yourself to too many color requirements in your deck. This flows into the next thing, which is limit your splashes. Again, single pip cards only. It is very rare that you can splash a double color costed card, for example, like splashing a double blue card in a black-red deck. And that's something that I think you should only be doing once you're very comfortable in draft, and only in very specific sets with very specific fixing. So for the most part, you're only going to want to splash single colored custom cards, and you really need to think, you don't want to splash unless it is a bomb or it fills a serious gap. So for example, you might splash Sauron because it's such a busted card, but you wouldn't splash Foray of Orcs unless your blue-black deck, for example, just had absolutely no removal and it wasn't a hard color-costed card to cast. So you need to make sure it's actually worth it to splash. So you've got to consider, look, if I'm playing this card, is it better than the 24th card? Is it better than the card that I would put in my deck or that I would draft if I didn't take this card? And you should only be putting it in if it really is that powerful. And similarly, you shouldn't be splashing if your deck is really strong. If you have a really strong 2-colored deck, the consistency of that deck is going to be more valuable than the additional power from the splash, and you should avoid it if doing so. But my final tip is if you do want to splash, you can use close picks or slightly later picks in a pack to set up splashes. For example, if there's land cycling creatures, you could take those, or if there is like an evolving wilds in the set, you could also take that as a speculative pick to help enable a future splash later down the line. The next thing to note is your creature count. You really need to make sure your decks have enough creatures, with that number being 14 to 18 in most decks. You can count non-creatures that create creatures. For example, in the current set, there's a lot of amass cards, and some of them are instants and sorceries, but they effectively create a creature. So you can count that as a body. And that's because most limited decks really rely on creatures dealing damage in order to win. So you need to make sure that your decks can consistently have enough pressure on the board to kill your opponent. But there are some exceptions. Some decks don't need creatures. Blue-red spells decks and some other spells decks in previous formats haven't required creatures always, but that's a very specific thing to a format and a very specific deck. And if you're drafting that deck, you know you don't need creatures. But for the most part, you want to make sure you have enough in order to have a board presence and be able to actually win the game. The next tip is sideboard cards. If you're playing best of 3 or you're drafting in real life, sideboard cards are where you can actually get a lot of value compared to other later picks in packs. Cards like the Black Breath and other very narrow cards that are good against certain decks can be really powerful, but you don't want to main deck them because against some decks they'll be total blanks. So you want to look to pick these up probably from about pick 8 onwards. If there's not really anything in the pack that looks great for you, you might think about taking a sideboard card like the Black Breath, and then if you see it play an opponent that has a lot of 1 toughness creatures, you can bring it in, and all of a sudden it becomes one of the best cards in your deck for games 2 and 3, and you're getting a lot more value than you typically would out of a pick 8 card. So make sure you're on the lookout for these as you draft in the later stages of the packs, and also know which cards are actually good sideboard cards against specific decks and when you should be bringing them in. And finally, my last tip is just have some fun. I think a lot of the time people get caught up on winning and drafting just the best deck, but ultimately we play draft to have fun. Obviously, if you're at the Pro Tour or playing on some arena qualifier event, you're going to be drafting seriously. But for the most part, this is about having fun. So take the Aragorn, the Uniter, take the really hard card to make work like Fall of Kar-Andros and try and do it. Try and have fun, draft decks that you like and find out which types of decks suit your style, that you have fun with and that you can win with, and you'll have a ton of fun. If you've got any questions about draft, please put a comment in and I'll endeavor to get to them and respond. Comments can range from anything to, what card should I be picking in this situation, to just more general comments about draft itself, but I'll be sure to answer them. And as always, please be sure to give this video a like if you enjoyed it and subscribe for more content in the future, and I'll see you in the next one.